First of all, of course I titled this way to be a little provocative, but Agile is irrelevant. And that's because the only thing that's relevant is actually delivering value. And I think one thing that in our industry that people sometimes get hung up on is process rather than product. And it can be for Agile coaches, Scrum Masters, trainers, whoever, it can be very easy to lose sight of that when you get into just thinking in Agile terms. So I'm going to sort of talk about a little bit. First of all, and this is, again, I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff that doesn't have to do with Agile at all, but it's key for its success. And the first one is prioritization. Now, no one likes to prioritize. And we all know this. And we all say in our backlogs, okay, it's going to be a single backlog that's going to be prioritized. But over and over again, whether at the team level, the team of teams level, or the enterprise level, everyone says everything is top priority. And priorities is a plural noun. It was interesting. So when I was writing my last book, I did a Google Ngram search on when that word came into the language, the English language. And it didn't really come into the language until the 1940s. And the reason for that is priority comes from the Latin a priori. It comes before. And so having more than one is nonsensical. But we all do it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we should think about it, because I think we do it for some systems reasons, not just because we're lazy thinkers and want everything at the same time. So what happens without prioritization? This is pretty good data that comes from the Standish Group, which is without prioritization, about a quarter of anybody in a group is working on stuff that people actually want. And I know we've all seen this in various customers in our companies that, only about a quarter of stuff people are working on is what people want. About half of it is stuff that's going to be rarely or never used. And that's because the prioritization isn't clear. This is the value we're driving to our customers. And this is why we need it. And then usually about a third of the people are doing stuff that nobody wants. And again, a lot of that is due to a lack of prioritization. Because it's not that people are like, oh, I'm going to do stuff that has no value. It's not clear. What are the things that have value? And if you have 20 priorities, top priorities, I was just at a client that had 20 top priorities. They don't have any, right? You just don't have any, which means the most junior person in your organization decides your corporate strategy because they get to pick what to work on. And if without the transparency of that prioritization, a lot of people, one client of ours a few years ago, we did it was, a couple thousand people. And so we did what is actually everyone working on? What are all the teams actually doing? We found this group of 4 or 5 teams that were working on something where the market window had passed 18 months earlier. And no one knew. The CEO of this group didn't want them to be doing it. The customers didn't want it. But this group of teams have been told, hey, this is what you should be working on. But because the prioritization wasn't clear, we're working on something with zero value. So the other thing we want to talk about is how do we do it across products? Because often when we talk about Scrum teams in the Agile community, we say, okay, the Scrum team is going to have, this guy's the Alpha team, they're going to have one set, they're going to be working on one thing, and their backlog is going to be really clear. But of course, that's never quite how it works. Because, okay, there's sprint backlog, but we need to have as a group of product owners, and Scrum scale, we call it a meta Scrum, call it whatever you want. But there's going to be different backlogs. There's going to be the team backlog, they're keeping the lights on stuff, all the projects, but then there might be another external project, some internal stuff. And every one of these, backlogs probably as a product owner to say, hey, I want this. I want this for the company and I need this team to do it. And so what often happens is people just load up the whole team. And then the team decides what the priorities are because they have no guidance between these, which is the most important. And what's really important is getting a group of product owners or leaders, whoever, again, I care very little about verbiage, whatever you want to call them, and get them to talk to each other about what the priorities are. Because what often happens is that, say there's a group of vice presidents or whatever, and they all have their own priorities and different things they want, and they just all throw it onto the team, but they don't talk to the other peers that they have on what the priorities are. And therefore, one of those may get done, or all of them might only get a little bit done, but then they blame the team rather than realizing where that decision is being made is their level, and they need to have a conversation about that. And again, what Agile does, what Scrum does, is set up a framework for those conversations to happen. That's the point. It's not following the framework. It's the second and third order effects of the framework. So they have clear prioritization. So they're going to say, what are we going to do? They might have their Kaizen, have some sort of interrupt buffer. And then the high-level priorities are set at whatever level at the Meta Scrum. Product owners have that conversation because they need to make the trade-offs there, not at the team level, at the product owner level, because they're the ones who have a more global view. And then those conversations informs the ordering of the sprint backlog. In the sprint planning, they establish their capacity, which is something I'm going to talk a lot about during the speech, is their capacity, and take in only the amount of work that they believe they can get done in that sprint. But that prioritization is going to be a mix of that stuff, right? Because there are things of different priorities that have to be done on different products and different initiatives. But it needs to have one backlog in priority order for that team to then focus and drive that sprint backlog to done. The other thing that I see people miss a lot is not understanding that there are sort of different types of work in any backlog. So there's, first of all, and this is what usually fills up the sprint backlog, is what you want to do, right? This is the cool stuff, the new product, the new process, initiative, whatever. It could be anything from transforming the organization to getting a product out the door, building up new capabilities. And often teams will just put this in their backlog, but then the other types of work eat their backlog and they don't get this stuff done. And so they don't know where their capacity is being spent. Because there's also what you have to do, right? This is keeping the lights on. You have some requirements. Maybe there's regulatory, just the business as usual stuff that you just have to do. It's not necessarily what you want to accomplish, but it's stuff you have to do, right? So you want to make sure that's in your backlog too. Otherwise, you won't have a sense of what your capacity is. And this stuff will eat up what you want to do. So you want to have a sense of that capacity because this stuff is going to get done no matter what. But then you have the stuff you can't plan. Now, some of it, like I call it operational responsibility, it's like the known unknowns. Like, let's say you're going to get a request. Maybe there's a subject matter expert on one of your teams that other teams are going to need that person to do something. Or you're like a help desk. You're going to get a certain number of calls, but you don't know how many. You sort of but you don't know when they're going to come in. And then there's the unexpected work, the unknown unknowns, emergencies, hallway tasking. The boss walks down the hallway. Hey, I need this. All this kind of stuff that you just don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But if you measure how much it happens, you can get some sort of sense of how much of your team's capacity or your teams of teams capacity or your enterprise's capacity is being used for this stuff. And so when you're putting together your backlog, you're going to say, okay, we're going to have some work we can plan, what we want to do, what we have to do. And we're going to leave like 50% of our capacity in this example for the unknown, the unplanned stuff that we know is going to go. And then if you're more a reactive team, like if you are a help desk, that might go up and have more unplanned work. And that's okay. That's fine. It's just having a sense of where your energies are being used and how. And is that in line with the priorities? Because if I see this a lot where a leader will come to a team that has, all their capacity to be eaten up by unplanned work and say, well, hey, all this planned stuff is what I want. And like, well, there's all this unplanned work that's coming in that we're told is a priority. So that's where we're spending our energy. But if you don't have all of that stuff in the backlog, all of that stuff visible, you can't change it. What you want to be able to do to people who are filling your backlog up, especially for leaders, is sort of say, here's what we're working on. Here's the unplanned stuff that come up. So just, this is what don't you want us to do? Hey, boss, no problem. We'll do whatever, but you have to pick. And then it can go down the other way where you can have more and more planned work. Like, let's say you're, an engineering team that's very focused on building one thing. One of our clients is a defense contractor. And they always say, the best projects are the ones with an armed guard at the door and the managers aren't allowed in because they don't have security clearance. They get to focus. But even then, those teams should save a little bit of their capacity for unplanned work because something will always happen. And these are just different kinds of teams or different kinds of backlogs, and it might change sprint to sprint depending on what reality is. If there's a global pandemic, for instance, there might be a lot of unplanned work as we all shifted to being virtual. So it's not that one is better than the other, because that's not the case. What I'm saying is that you need to know where it's being spent. And maybe you want to drive down the business as usual. Maybe you want to drive down the unplanned work, or maybe there's an emergency you have to do. But if there is an emergency, you have to be able to tell your leaders, hey, this other stuff isn't going to happen. So You could say, on one end, it might be innovation. You're trying to build new things. At the other end, might be a reaction team. Either's fine. And that's not that one team's always going to be one way or the other, but know where your capacity is being spent. So, and this will allow you to do so. Let's say, it's really easy to prioritize across one team, but if you have multiple teams, how are you going to do that? And again, you have the shared backlog. They're all working on one project. And then you need to have the product owner team get together. Okay, how are we going to divide this work? And again, it's that product owner team or that leadership team, whatever you want to call it, that needs to have that discussion. How is this going to be broken down and fed into different teams' backlogs? What are the dependencies between teams? How is this all going to work? Because you'll often see if they don't have this conversation, a dependency can stop one of these teams completely because it's not planned for it. The group of product owners hasn't had that conversation. And this is even important at a enterprise level. So just yesterday, day before yesterday, I was in England. I was working with a customer there, and they have about 40,000 people. And over the next quarter, there are these 20 big things that this leadership team wants to get done. And so what we worked with them, and this took a lot of pre-work, was get what are all those big things? What is the order is from across the enterprise? So these are big things that, huge functions have to interact with each other to actually get this stuff done. Then you have some sort of this executive Metascrum or whatever you want to call it, organizes those product backlog items to make the most out of their budgets because, they have to be able to spend the money right. Where is that going to come from? And prioritize. And then as they go through, this is the first time this group is doing it, but as you go through, like at the end of the quarter, like we're going to do check-ins every 3 or 4 weeks with them, with a group of product owners. But as you get at the end of the quarter, we're going to say, okay, what of those 20 things did they actually accomplish? What was actually done? They said they're going to do 20. And I actually told the senior leader there, I said, if they get more than 10, I'll buy a bottle of scotch because there's no way they're going to get more than 10 done. But they guessed, like this is the first time, so they don't have an idea of what their enterprise capacity is over a very large enterprise. But as you move through and revisiting this, you get a sense. So let's say they only get 10 done this quarter of these big epics. Well, let's not try to do more than 10 next quarter because we know it's not going to happen. And when people say, oh, well, it has to happen, all those are really important, it's like, well, it's not going to. It's simply not going to happen. And so if you insist on everything happening, it won't. I was at this large finance institution a couple of years ago, and they're doing a merger, and they had a bunch of stuff they had to get done by a date, regulatory date. And I went in and I was talking to one of the teams, and I said, okay, how many things in your sprint backlog? They're like, 170. I was like, well, how many did you get done last sprint? They're like, 15. And I was like, okay, well, why do you have 170 in there? That's insane. He goes, well, we have to. That's what leadership says we have to accomplish in order to meet this date. And actually, I went back and I was like, okay, how many did you finish? They're like 18. And they're like, how many do you have to do next? 180. And so it's just like, it's not going to happen. I went to the leadership team and I said, listen, this is not going to happen by this date. And today you get to pick which customers you're going to lose. In 6 months, when this date comes and you're still insisting all this is going to happen and it's not going to happen, you could lose all of them or lose your most important ones. So again, it's just getting that sense of what is the capacity to deliver and then acknowledging that. And then you can actually say what can be done. Now, yes, do we want teams to improve? Do we want them to get faster? Do we want them to deliver higher quality? Yes, but plan with reality and with data. And as you get more data, as you go sprint by sprint, month by month, quarter by quarter, you can get a better sense. And what Scrum does do, and is really good at, is improving those outcomes, improving what you can accomplish. But it's really important that you don't try to overcommit to lines. So like one example of this, a couple of years ago, 3M bought Scott Safety. Scott Safety makes protective equipment for firefighters and people who work in chemical plants, that kind of thing. And this is a $2.5 billion acquisition. And if you've ever been involved in one of these, this kind of acquisition is really complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces and you need input from IT and from security and from legal and from HR. So you need a bunch of different parts of the company that don't actually coordinate all that often because they're fairly independent. But in a merger, you've got to get them all together. And not all of these groups were agile. They weren't. So how it looked like was this. So at 3M, or this part of 3M, IT and R&D have gone through their agile transformations, with more or less success, depending on, the time and which part. 3M's big. But, they are agile. But legal department, not agile. Manufacturing, not agile. HR, not agile at the time. I think they've done some more in HR. But so what they did is they formed this merger Scrum team, which was like a group of product owners, a meta Scrum for lack of a better term, that they met. They did dailies 3 times a week. They had visible backlogs, of course, it's 3M, so they post-its everywhere. But what they did is they say, this group of product owners, guys, here's the work that needs to be done. And so like the head of legal would go back, okay, great. And he goes back and he's not dealing with Scrum teams, but he's saying, okay, lawyers, we need this thing done. And this is the priority. Otherwise, this other merger teams are going to get held up. And as the head of legal there said, he says, listen, we're at 3M. We make personal protective equipment. We're involved in thousands of lawsuits at any one time. And, there's a lot of stuff going on. But by having the transparency of the prioritization for this merger to be successful, I was able to prioritize appropriately, even with teams that weren't agile. Because agile is irrelevant in this kind of thing. Does it make it easier? Would I like everybody in 3M to be on Scrum teams? Yeah, but that's not always going to happen. And certainly in some of these large organizations will never happen. Not everyone is going to be on the Scrum team. So you need to figure out ways of coordinating and a stable interface. How do we flow prioritization across multiple teams, whether they're agile or not? Because that's how you can do something this big. You can't do it assuming everybody's going to get, go get a Scrum Master certificate and, be in training and have a bunch of Agile coaches, because that's just not going to happen. In some areas it'll happen. But if you're trying to do something coordinating a bunch of groups, both agile and non-agile, or if you're different parts of the agile transformation of the organization, it's not that you can stop until everyone's agile and organized on teams in an agile way to keep on doing work. You still have to work. So how do you keep on getting things done in the middle of an agile transformation? Or, hey, we're transforming this part and that's as far as we're going to go. And that happens a lot. Some organizations do not become 100%. Very few become, large organizations become 100% agile across the entire group. Some, but very rare. So you do need to figure out, as an organization, as an enterprise, how are you going to coordinate both your agile teams and your non-agile teams? Because it doesn't matter whether they're agile or not. What matters is, are they producing the value? That's the only thing that matters. And so in this case, they were able to do it. They were on time. But also because they were able to shift these priorities around, they're actually able to seize market opportunities, which often doesn't happen during a giant merger because everything freezes and locks. And it's hard to change. And that's what that transparency of the prioritization brings to an organization, because you can change it a lot easier. So if you have this scaled delivery and you have these teams of product owners breaking things up, what is the role of the Scrum Masters? Their role is to say, okay, that's what we are going to do. And this is classic Agile 101. There's the what, and then there's the how. But you're doing it in a scaled environment, you're going to have a bunch of Scrum Masters who talk to each other in a Scrum of Scrums, or a Scrum of Scrum of Scrums, or however high up you want to go. And their job is to work with the team, figure out the impediments, and raise them up, and get those impediments into the product backlogs, right? Because fixing them needs to go up against the product owners and say, hey, this impediment is slowing us down. If we fix it, we think it'll speed us up this much. And the thing you got to remember, Agilists, is sometimes the product owners will say, you know what, we'll live with it. We recognize that fixing that might be important, but you know what, given the value we want, that one's okay. We're going to take that hit. Or it could be something like, you see teams raise this, where it's like, oh, we want to change. This is a huge impediment, but maybe that impediment is gravity, right? Or some sort of government regulation, a law, a legal requirement, a safety requirement that, may make your work harder, but we have to do it. We have no choice. And they want to figure out how to deliver and get those teams to deliver together. So there's a unified shared body of work. So the other thing is, you want to be able to do the right thing in the right way. And we often talk about velocity in the Agile world, but velocity is different than speed. Speed by itself, everyone loves teams that go fast, but velocity is speed in a direction that's guided by that product backlog and that prioritization. And so as Scrum Masters, as Agilists, you really need to take that into account. It's not just how well your teams are doing Scrum, because at the end of the day, so, I'm looking at my iPhone. I know that there are a bunch of Scrum teams working on my iPhone all the time and sending me updates every other day. Do I care that they're Scrum teams? Do I care that they have a retrospective at all? No. I care that my phone works. That's the only thing I care about. How they get that there, that's them. That's internal. But the thing you got to remember is delivery to the customer is the only thing that matters. So the Scrum Master, this is in the Scrum Guide, is accountable for the Scrum team's effectiveness. And I think that's something that is really important. And when talking to Jeff and Ken, when they rewrote the guide a couple of years ago, they really wanted to stress this because it's not about the speed of the team. It's not about how well they do Scrum. It's not about how continuous improvement. All of those things are great, but the combination has to add up to effectiveness, effectively delivering value and the right value. And that's what the Scrum team and Scrum team coach or Scrum Master is responsible for and accountable for. Now, to level up, an Agile coach or an enterprise coach or a Scrum Master, if you're coordinating a bunch of teams, they're accountable for the release, the delivery of those joint teams with greater throughput, lower cost, and higher quality. They're not accountable for how well they do Scrum. They're accountable for the release of that effort. Faster, cheaper, better. Now, that group of Scrum of Scrums, people talk about that. Again, they need to be, again, a consistent flow of valuable finished product to customers. That's what a Scrum of Scrums is going to do. A Scrum of Scrums is not there just to fix impediments. A Scrum of Scrums is not there to make sure their teams are happy. A Scrum of Scrums is to get valuable finished product to customers. Now, fixing impediments, having happy teams, those are great, but those are all in service of this. They're not in service of themselves. Spoke to my father about the first Scrum team a while back. And he said, so he talks to the first Scrum team. This is in 1993 at Easel. And he says, okay, you know how you guys are always late? Management's always yelling at you because you're late. You're working nights and weekends. Can't get anything done. He says, I can take all that away. I can give you your lives back. But there's one condition. You have to deliver. If you don't deliver, all of that other stuff is going to come back. So that's one of the things that I really stress with all of my customers and all of the Agile coaches we have at Scrum Inc. or the consultants is the whole point is delivery. It's not great Agile. We hypothesize Agile teams, and we have pretty good data that shows this to be true. Agile teams are the best way to deliver value. What I also say is we have to be radical pragmatists. If something else works better, do that. There was in one of the Slack groups I'm in with a bunch of Scrum trainers, someone said, I have this client and they didn't have a product owner for this group of teams. And they're saying, we're not going to do any work until we have a product owner because that's what the Scrum Guide says. And I wrote back, I was like, that's insane. You're going to keep, I think it was like 6 or 7 teams not working for like 3 or 4 weeks because you don't have a product owner. You have to do something. I said, if Scrum is getting in the way of you actually getting some value, stop doing Scrum. There's no point. And they're like, and don't come. Of course, he was asking. My father commented, he's in the Slack channel too. And he was like, the whole point of Scrum is to deliver stuff. If it's not delivering stuff, you're obviously doing it wrong. It's not. And if anyone says, we can't because the Scrum Guide says something or the rules of Agile or whatever, stop. It's about getting stuff done. Now, I had a conversation. This is just yesterday. And I've thought about this before, but this is really, so this is someone who worked at a large energy company and did really large projects with Agile practices like build refineries and stuff like that. And I asked her what metrics she used. And she said the metric she thought was the most important was how much of the product backlog, let's say they committed to 200 things, how much did they get done in the time they said? Sprint to sprint, month to month, quarter to quarter, doesn't matter. Whatever it is, that the power of that gives you the predictability because what all the people want to know is when are things going to be done, right? And if you have 200 things, you get 80 of them done, and you bring 200 things into your next iteration, you're not going to get them done. So people can't count on you. And so give it the power of the promise. So if you measure one thing, measure how well your teams keep their word. because that allows for planning. Also, it allows for getting into the teams and seeing what's getting in their way. And why do they think? And teams always do this, especially in the beginning, or groups of teams, or this enterprise I was talking about, is they overstretch. They think they can get more done, or they've been told they have to get more done. What you want to have is, what does reality look like? And again, when you really first start, you guess, right? You just guess and see what happens. But over time, and this is one of the things Agile does do, it gives you the data. Gives you the data to improve. So you know when you say, my teams will be able to deliver X number of backlog items by Y date, you have confidence in that. Another thing that I want to stress, this is when I was talking to the Standards Group CEO, Jim Johnson, he, I'm sure many of you have seen the data that Agile projects are much more likely to succeed than traditional project management. That's, and that it's fairly dramatic in terms, and this is the Standards Group that looks at tens of thousands of projects globally and has for like 30 years. But Jim was telling me, he said, listen, says that's just a correlation. And so he wanted to figure out, what is the causation? What does Agile do? What does Scrum do? And when going through his data, he actually said, part of it is, how long does it take to make a decision once you know a decision needs to be made? And in his data set, if it took less than an hour, the success of those projects went up about 75%. And if it took more than 5 hours, that dropped to about 21%. Think about it. 5 hours is not a lot of time. But most decisions are trivial at the team level, right? It's like, do we do this way or this way? And if they have to send that back up for approval, and it takes 2 weeks until the committee meets, it's just horrific. It just takes forever and just stops everything. And you can see why those projects become late and over budget and not as good, because it's the speed of decision making. Now, some decisions are system level decisions that need to be approved, like major architectural decisions or policy, whatever. But most decisions aren't. And one of the discussions that I encourage all of you to have is, what are the guardrails? What decisions can't the teams make? Like, wow, you cannot make, you cannot decide on a safety thing on with a reactor. What we're going to do, don't make that up. You can't innovate there because that's dangerous. But there's a lot of other stuff you can. And so just figuring out where those firewalls are, because you want to give the teams the ability to innovate, the ability to make decisions, the ability to experiment within, guardrails. And so deciding what those are is really important. And having that up front so the teams know where they can't, because often teams feel they can't make decisions because they've been yelled at when they have made one. And maybe they got yelled at because they violated something that was really important and safety related, for example. And so then they stop making decisions by themselves because they're afraid of getting punished, even though if they did some things, they could. And then another thing that I was talking to, so one of the consultants at Scrum used to work for a large defense contractor. And she actually said that the way that, because I get asked a lot, why have Scrum Masters? They're expensive. And if you have a large project, but a couple hundred teams, you're going to have a couple hundred Scrum Masters. That adds up really fast in terms of money. So whenever she went into a large project at this defense contractor, she would have to use non-Agile metrics to demonstrate the impact and the ROI of Scrum and Agile. So what she would do is she would analyze historical projects, similar ones, but you'd look at them as cost, schedule, and quality. How expensive is it? How long does it take? How good is it? And then she would measure the velocity of delivery to meet those metrics, to improve those metrics. How much do we need to improve those metrics to drive cost? And then measuring, saying, if we have this continuous improvement cycle that improves the velocity of meeting those metrics, that's how much money we save. And then Scrum Masters pay for themselves. But she had to do that both internally at this defense contractor and also with the contractor's customers, the Pentagon or the services, and say, this is why we're bidding this much. Because we feel if we do this investment in the Agile infrastructure, it will deliver better, cheaper, better, and faster. And if you can't, and again, she had to do it with non-Agile metrics, with real numbers. Because to the purchaser, to the customer, again, they're buying something really big, like a submarine, money matters. And if you can't show that the Agile stuff is having this kind of impact and will have this impact, they won't pay for it. And some companies I talk to are very, even ones pretty far along their Agile journey, you're now saying, leadership's going, why are we paying all these Scrum Masters? That's a huge investment because they see that as a line item. It's like, wow, we have 300 Scrum Masters. That's millions of dollars every year. Are we seeing the impact? And if the Scrum Masters say, well, my teams are doing really good Scrum, they're going to go, well, we don't need you. So you have to demonstrate the impact and make that visible, not just in terms of, hey, what's their velocity? Are they doing good retrospectives? They have a Kaizen, they continuous improving, but in what are they driving in terms of value? How expensive is it? How long does it take? And how good is it? And how are they affecting that? And that's something I would encourage all Agilists to pay a lot of attention to, because often that stuff is being done. You are making things better. Those metrics are moving, but you don't make your impact visible to leadership who are making these financial decisions. And especially in a financial economy that we're in right now, where, you've seen all the layoffs that are happening, people being sort of nervous of a recession. People are looking at their companies going, where can I cut if I have to? And believe me, Agile, hey, let's cut that. That's just cost. They aren't engineers. They aren't hands on keyboards. They're just cost. So unless you can show the impact of what you're doing, shoot, that's where I'd cut. If I couldn't prove I'm investing millions and millions of dollars into an area and I can't demonstrably show with financial metrics that this is having an impact, and I'm worried about the survival of the company, that's where I cut. So you have to make it visible, but not in terms of Agile metrics, because they don't care how well you do Scrum at all. They kind of care, and they think that Agile, and they see the impact of Agile, but you need to make it visible to them. Because at the end of the day, they're accountable to investors, to the market, to, or if they're in the government, they're accountable for using the taxpayers' money right. They're accountable for different things, and none of them have to do with how well you're doing Scrum. So how are you delivering the value? And it doesn't have to be money. I work with a lot of nonprofits as well, but how are we measuring that? Because nonprofits want, they want to cut costs and be able to deliver their mission for a lower cost. So for their donors can get more for their donation. So it's figuring out what that value is and how you do it and show the value of an Agile implementation. So I'll just leave you with this, which is, what you can accomplish is measure impact, not process. Don't get wrapped up in, is everyone doing perfect Scrum? Would that be great? Awesome. But get there by measuring the impact of what the teams are doing, not how well they're doing a process. Plan reality, not fantasy. As I was talking about, how well can your teams make the commitments they make? Ruthlessly prioritize, but again, not just at the team level, across everything that team needs to do, and recognize that there's other things that might not be they're working on this project. There's going to be other stuff in their backlog that they have to, or surprises they're going to have to deal with. So we need to prioritize that. Again, scale the Scrum Master and measure the impact. Speed that decision-making. And that's actually something that's pretty easy to track. Once you know you need to make a decision, boom, pop it into your backlog management, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or Jira or DevOps, Azure DevOps, whatever it is, and just measure how long. Okay, we needed to make this decision, just measure it. How long did it take? And then measure the velocity of the whole, not of the parts. And this goes back to that 3M example. Because you're just measuring how fast the legal team made the decisions they needed around that merger. Well, that's great. The legal team's really fast. But that's not going to drive the merger. But you need all those parts together. So what's the full value stream mapping is a big term. It comes out of Lean. Again, not Agile, but that's a really good tool. What is the velocity of the whole? From you have an idea to delivery to customers, how long does that take? And then you look at where those bottlenecks are. But you don't say, oh, well, engineering is going really fast. We're great. Well, no. What if sales isn't going really fast and they can't sell it? It doesn't matter what the engineers make or how good they are, or how great the product is, unless we can get the whole value stream. to be delivering value. Because agility is not the goal. Agility is how you get there. And I really encourage you to keep that in mind at all times. And when you're talking to people about why they should be agile, why they should do Scrum, it's not to do good Scrum. It's to deliver value.